Hello there! Welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. For those of you that didn't see my last video, where I took a look at all of the Time Splitters games running on the deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the Steam Deck's unique position as a handheld gaming PC. To do that, we're going to look at getting every single version of every single SSX game running on the deck. Via emulation, I'll be testing every port of each game released across both console and PC, and recording footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I'll then give each game a compatibility score out of 10, and issue a final recommendation on which one you should play. In order for a game to get top marks, it'll need to run at its full correct frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Additionally, each port will need to render at the deck's native screen resolution. I'll also be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus, yeah? It's worth mentioning that these videos take a hefty chunk of time to put together. With that in mind, I want them to be a service to you, the viewer. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe subscribe. If you have a particular franchise you'd like to see tested on the deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. Oh, and as always, I'll only be testing through SteamOS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games. Much like Time Splitters, EA's SSX got its start as a launch title for the PlayStation 2, arriving in our laps on October 26th, 2000. It's difficult to imagine a console launch occurring today with the kind of high-tier exclusives that made up the PS2's initial release, but that's just what the gaming landscape looked like back in the early 2000s. What I find particularly striking about the original SSX now is how fully formed it is. I criticised Time Splitters 1 in our last episode for feeling like a beta version of its follow-ups, but that is certainly not the case with SSX, even though that's kind of what SSX 1 is, as we'll find out later. Revisiting this game is kind of like playing an older version of FIFA football. It's the same game, the framework is there, and it holds up remarkably well. It just doesn't have the flair and polish that later games in the series ended up having. The character roster is varied, multinational, and caricatural, which is typical for the series. The art style has that Y2K elegance, but in a very literal sense. The trick system, which is as unique and central to the franchise's Skates control scheme, flows in a way that most modern games just don't. It's all shockingly well realised for a console launch title from 23 years ago. Each consecutive SSX game that was released after this one built on the core features that this game established. There was no revisionism required. It stands toe-to-toe with the likes of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and any other decent extreme sports title in that regard. Sadly, the craftsmanship that went into this excellent first outing hasn't transitioned over to the Steam Deck remarkably well. We're playing the game through PPSSPP on the deck, installed via emudeck. As you work your way through the game's tutorial, the outlook is positive. The performance doesn't waver too much from the 60 FPS target. The game's audio does tend to warp and slow slightly erratically, however, it doesn't seem too intrusive at this early stage. Get into a full race event, however, and the wheels fall off completely. Before making any tweaks to the emulator settings, the game's performance took an absolute nosedive down to the 30 FPS mark, frantically jumping between 30 and 60 frames per second thereafter. I hardly need to mention how much of a problem this presents in a game that relies so much on precise input. I managed to claw back some performance by using power tools to switch off SMT. This elevated my FPS back up to 50 or so, however, it was anything but consistent, rising and falling harshly whenever my opponents entered and left my field of view. The audio issues I noticed during the tutorial also got a lot worse. It made the game sound like someone putting a Ministry of Sound album through a sausage maker. It's a real shame, as I really started to feel the itch to sink some time into SSX on deck as soon as I played the tutorial. Unfortunately, the performance here is simply too variable to recommend, as it compromises your control at every literal turn. Couple that with the severe audio issues, and the original SSX on deck gets a particularly goofy 4 out of 10.
This is gonna be very, very interesting.
Just 1 year after SSX's dynasty was established, EA Vancouver dropped what is probably considered to be one of the best arcade sports titles of all time, with SSX Tricky launching in November of 2001. As a sequel, it's quite a strange one, as it's essentially the same game as the original SSX, albeit with some small but important tweaks to the overall formula. You see, the original SSX reviewed positively with critics, but it didn't really sell all that well. probably on account of the fact that it kind of blended in with a lot of other extreme sports titles on the market. EA's solution to this wasn't to can the series and sack the developer, but instead to give their Vancouver studio essentially a second go at making the game. The output of that process was nothing short of incredible. It was as if every wishlist idea that was scrapped from the original game was realised for Tricky. The visuals, for starters, were completely overhauled, giving the game a much needed sense of identity that set it apart from its peers. The core control system was redesigned to be more fluid, and coming straight from the original SSX, it's definitely felt. The entire game just feels more dynamic as a result of these changes. Another key alteration could be found in the game's courses, which had a huge number of shortcuts, grind rails, and points of interest added to them. By 2001 standards, this was an almost eyebrow-raising way to go about making a sequel. However, it paid off in spades. To this day, Tricky is loved by fans and critics alike, and the adulation is well deserved. As for how the game runs on deck, well, we're kicking things off with the Xbox version of the game running via XEMU. Right from the off, you can likely see that the game is plagued by graphical issues. Transparencies like shadows and fog have a really difficult time rendering correctly in this version of the game. It's a shame too, as the Xbox version of Tricky is probably the best looking port available. Once you get stuck into an actual event, the frame rate really begins to tumble. Don't trust the FPS readout you're seeing on screen here. GameScope tends to incorrectly report frame rates within XEMU, so we can only really use it as a rough guide. What I can tell you from playing the game myself is that controller response feels poor, and you can see how the environment judders past the camera whenever I turn left or right, indicating that events aren't unfolding as smoothly as our FPS counter is leading us to believe. Audio quality suffers immensely within XEMU also. With sound being such a central pillar to SSX as a series, this really impacts the overall experience on deck. There are only so many snaps, crackles and pops that I can hear before I begin mistaking my Steam Deck for a popular yet bland variety of children's breakfast cereal. No amount of fiddling with SMT via power tools, XEMU's own VSync, or the deck's equivalent settings brought about any improvement to the game's performance or visual quality in this case. This is another poor showing for XEMU, an emulator that is certainly promising, yet is still in its nascent stage, especially on deck. Tricky's inconsistent frame rate and presentational peasantry lands the game with a compatibility rating of 4 out of 10. Switching gears over to Dolphin and emulating the purple cube-shaped console's version of Tricky yields much better results than on Xbox. For starters, all of the game's graphical effects are being rendered correctly. Fog is fog, shadows are shadows, and perhaps most importantly, snow is snow. Audio quality fares much better here too, with only very slight stutters and skips having a passing impact. It isn't until we get into our first race event that we are affected by Dolphin's poor level of optimization on deck, with frame pacing in particular becoming very unsteady as the camera pans across the scene. A commenter on my last episode provided us with a set of instructions on how to potentially improve Dolphin's performance on deck and alleviate the emulator's stutter struggle. To do this, we need to set the deck's screen refresh rate to 59Hz, enable VI skip within Dolphin's settings, disable SMT within Power Tools, and then set our available cores to 3. Lastly, we change our GPU clock to 1200 MHz, and that's that. After making these changes, the game's behaviour is certainly different. However, I would hesitate to call it an outright improvement. Instead of constantly stuttering during motion, the game's stutters now feel relegated to every half second or so. The huge lurches in performance down to 30 FPS are still here, however. In fact, they now show up even on GameScope's frame rate graph. With that said, huge thanks to anyone that shares their performance tips in the comments, and I'll be sure to keep this one in my back pocket for future testing against any other Dolphin games that have issues on deck. Ah, Dolphin, why do you have to do this to me? Dolphin is an immaculately supported bit of software on other platforms, and even on deck through other operating systems. It's just SteamOS that appears to have this weird grudge against how the emulator presents images on a screen. With that said, SSX Tricky's variable and unreliable performance via Dolphin lands it with a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on deck. Rounding out Tricky's roster of home console ports, we've got PCSX2 emulating the PS2 version of the game. By all accounts, the best way to experience this port on deck is to switch off SMT using power tools right from the get-go. And doing that, we get remarkably smooth performance across even the game's most demanding courses. As an emulator, PCSX2 continues to show up in a really positive way on deck. The controls in particular here feel incredibly well tuned to Valve's machine. Audio is another highlight. The game's soundscape is preserved beautifully in this version of the game. The only thing holding Tricky on PCSX2 back from greatness is a slight issue with the way in which the terrain is rendered. In certain sections, you'll see the ground culled out in squares on the edge of your vision. It doesn't impact gameplay in any way at all, however, it does bear mentioning. It's easy to recommend Tricky's PlayStation 2 port as the best version of the game to play on deck. Near flawless performance, great compatibility and tight controls all result in an emulated game that feels more like a port. The aforementioned graphical issues are the only blemish on an otherwise excellent experience. Tricky on PS2 gets 9 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Hey, you thought we were finished, didn't you? You thought, oh, he's going to do the bit with the scores now. Well, feast your eyes, friends. This is SSX Tricky on Game Boy Advance, running via RetroArch's GBA core. It would probably be more fitting to call this version SSX Trickly. Honestly, this is a nightmare to play. The most impressive thing about this version is the fact that they managed to squeeze a small part of Tricky's opening cutscene onto the Game Boy Advance, which essentially serves as an advertisement for the home console version of the game. Once you're actually in game, it plays like a dream you'd have about the real SSX Tricky after seeing someone play it from the other side of the street and through their living room window. Huge respect to the developers for getting a rough approximation of Tricky onto a handheld as weak as the GBA, but this really doesn't play well at all. Which is why it's incredibly frustrating that I'm about to give out this series' first perfect score. Remember, I score games based on their compatibility on deck as opposed to their objective quality as a game. And yeah, Tricky on GBA transitions to the deck perfectly. No FPS or audio issues, it upscales nicely. MGBA's SSX Trickly gets a perfect 10 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. And now we're done with SSX Tricky. That's every port of the game tested on deck. Tallying up our scores, we see the PS2 version of the game taking the home console crown with a 9 out of 10 compatibility score, and the GBA version of the game receiving this show's first 10 out of 10 score. This is utter insanity. Neither of these consoles could be here to collect their respective awards today, however I did receive a note asking that we thank both AA batteries and having no backlight on the GBA's behalf. By the time SSX's third installment was ready to be unleashed onto the world, the series had firmly cemented itself as one of the hottest properties in console gaming. Launching on October 20th, 2003, SSX3 is the hat-trick jewel in the franchise's crown. Whilst its predecessor Tricky may be more immediately playable thanks to its familiar menu and event-based structure, I've always been drawn to the sense of freedom and the sheer scale that SSX3 has in its open mountain design. Visually, the game is just gorgeous, even today. The art style and technical execution come together to bring a cohesion to the series that really wasn't there before. It all fits together under a banner of cool, slick and very European Y2K-ness. Having had 3 games to refine SSX's control scheme, we see another jump in quality and responsiveness this time around, allowing for a frankly ridiculous amount of rotations whilst you're in the air, but hey, who cares about realism when it feels this good? The iconic soundscape of the series has also been remodeled for this entry, with EA Radio Big's in-universe host updating you on events and other goings-on as you roam the mountain slopes and listen to some prime mid-noughties beats. The orchestra hits that accompany Big Tricks are back, and landing a tasty move still makes me smile and nod my head in self-approval all these years later. Everything comes together perfectly in SSX3. There's an insightful analogy to be made here about, peaks of a mountain and 3 being the franchise's peak and all that, but me, I'm too stupid to finish that thought. Dropping into XEMU then to check out the Xbox version of the game, and we bear witness to what is undoubtedly the best looking version of SSX3. As a quick side note, SSX3 is featured in Xbox's own backwards compatibility program on their series consoles. Those machines run this exact version of the game, upscaled to 4K, and golly gosh, it looks immaculate. If the Steam Deck could even retain a portion of that experience's brilliance, we'd be onto something. But unfortunately, this is one of those titles that suffers from consistent performance issues that really drag the quality level down. You've a double whammy here of poor performance and dodgy frame pacing that stutters by the bucket load. The audio playback is once again poor, although it's not as bad as we've seen in some other cases with XEMU, a mild yet consistent crackle, like one of those shit Aldi record players. During my time with the game on deck, I also noticed the same alpha transparency bug on Distant Fog that was present in Tricky's Xbox version. It looks like this is a widespread issue within the emulator. Ultimately, if there was no other way to play SSX 3 on Steam Deck, this would be okay. It just isn't perfect at all. Poor performance, bad frame pacing, and crackling audio hold this version of the game back from excelling on deck. They also land the game with a 5 out of 10 compatibility rating. Truly mid. Pairing up SSX 3 with Dolphin yields the best result yet I've seen for this emulator on deck. Yes, we still have to put up with that constant frame pacing stutter, and God knows I want to see a fix for that sooner rather than later, but by using the settings I've listed down in the description, I was able to play the game with reasonably smooth performance, mostly pegged at that 60 FPS target. There were some occasional drops that felt as though the Steam Deck was locking down to 30 frames per second before jumping back up to 60. Double buffered VSync behaviour, essentially. The visuals here are a close match for the original version on console. Thankfully, Dolphin is mature enough as an emulator that we don't really need to worry about the kinds of graphical issues that tend to rear their unloved heads in XEMU or PPSSPP. The emulator does have an issue playing back the game's pre-rendered cutscenes, however. This is a common issue with EA games from around this era running on Dolphin. The video codec EA used doesn't play nice with the emulator as I understand it. Audio seems pretty good. I did notice some slight warping whenever performance waved from that 60 FPS target, but overall it seemed fine. We're only 2 episodes into this series and I'm already sick of giving out about Dolphin's performance on deck. This game should receive a 9 or a 10 out of 10 for compatibility, as it would on other platforms running Dolphin. In its current form, however, the frame pacing and occasional hard frame rate drops to 30 hold this version of the game back on deck. SSX 3 within Dolphin gets a very IGN 7 out of 10 for compatibility. Now look, sorry to interrupt, but I've actually been lying to you this entire time. You see, this video is meant to be every single port of every single SSX game running on the Steam Deck, but well, it isn't. There was one version of SSX 3 that we can't test on deck for this video, and it was released on the bloody Gizmondo. Electronic Arts, the same company that made Anthem, also ported SSX 3 to the worst selling console of all time. And I really want to play it. Whilst I was researching this video, I found that an enterprising individual online was developing a Gizmondo emulator at one stage, but later confirmed on Reddit that they had walked away from the project to focus on other stuff. I'm disappointed, for one because the game looks fascinating and I really want to play it, but also because I'm a bit of a perfectionist and I really did want to cover every single version of SSX on the deck. Regardless, we still have to rate it. If you had told me 3 years ago that one day I'd say the sentence that I'm about to say, I'd tell you to step away slowly and stop drinking the crazy juice. Anyway, here goes. The Gizmondo version of SSX 3 gets a compatibility rating of 0 on the Steam Deck. I'm going to cut right to the chase here. SSX 3 on PS2 played via PPSSPP is a very welcome experience on deck. Visually, the game is an exact match to its console counterpart, and the rendering issues that impacted prior SSX games on PPSSPP are gone. With SMT disabled within Power Tools, performance is as close to a lock on 60 FPS as I feel we're going to get, and it really feels great to play. In the footage you're currently watching, I'm playing the game through the preview window of a capture card without using the card's pass-through ability. I'd like to think that's a testament to how good PPSSPP controls on the deck, which I've mentioned many times before. This is without a doubt the quintessential way to play SSX 3 on the Steam Deck. However, it isn't without its problems. The audio quality here leaves something to be desired, as it routinely warps and skips just enough for you to notice as you're playing. This is really the only thing keeping this version of the game back from being completely perfect, and I imagine you could make further tweaks to PPSSPP's settings to alleviate the problem. If you've any tips on doing that, please do let me know in the comments. I'm relieved that there is at least one version of this phenomenal game that we can comfortably play on the deck. Solid frame pacing, a great frame rate, excellent visuals and responsive controls elevate PPSSPP above the other emulators in our testing, with just the audio intermittently giving us some trouble. SSX 3 on PPSSPP gets a compatibility rating of 9 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Yippee! Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been in the club just the other day? I have to turn this off, I can't listen to that. As you may have already gathered, this is SSX 3 running on the Game Boy Advance within GBA on the Steam Deck. I mean, it looks interesting. Much like the GBA's prior approximation of SSX Tricky, the nicest thing I can say here is that there was an attempt. To be frank, however, stuff like this has always fascinated me. I mean, it's likely the reason why I'm making this series in the first place. When I was younger and I didn't have access to the internet, I used to buy ports like this for the GBA, the PSP and the DS, just because I wanted to see how they managed to run. How they squished a complete home console experience down to mobile hardware of the time. Let's be real though, nothing other than nostalgia is going to have you playing this particular version of the game on Steam Deck. With that said, the deck's performance here is obviously flawless, and an exact match for the original version on the Game Boy Advance. This means that through gritted teeth, I have to concede that SSX3 on MGBA scores a perfect compatibility score of 10 out of 10. Great. And that's every single version of SSX3 that we can cover on deck. Here's a quick recap of the scores, and the PS2 version of the game edges out the competition once again. It's also joined by the GBA version, which scores the series' second 10 out of 10 rating. As mentioned before, both the PS2 and the GBA couldn't be here to accept their awards. However, I have just been handed another note that says to thank both Shrek, Hassel in the Castle, and Wormlights on the GBA's behalf. Lovely. Sorry, what is this? Hey? Look, I'll be honest, prior to making this video, I only had a passing knowledge of SSX on tour. I was aware of the fact that the aesthetic had been kind of scuffed up a little for this entry, and I knew that they'd added skis, despite having made fun of skiers for 3 games. What I didn't know, however, was that the game's art style lands somewhere between Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, Guitar Hero, and the original Skate. Gone are the electro beats that served as the perfect backdrop to the series so far. They've been replaced by Billy Talent and Avenged Sevenfold. I shouldn't complain, I love that kind of music, and I grew up loving all of those other franchises. In fact, if I knew nothing about SSX and someone told me it was a snowboarding game from the early 2000s, this is probably what I'd imagine. But there's no denying that this game was a huge stylistic departure for the series. At the time, you could see this reflected in the game's review scores also. SSX games had been scoring in the high 80s and the low 90s up to that point. Now, however, we were firmly in 70% country. The scribbled sort of school notebook style of the UI and the menus, it rubs me the wrong way. I've never been a fan of that look. Mechanically though, the game is as strong as it ever was, if not even more so. Further refinements were made to the control scheme, and grinding in particular feels far more achievable and intuitive this time around. Outside of that, it's clear that the series had perhaps passed its peak at this stage, but it's more SSX, which is never truly a bad thing, right? Right? We're kicking off our testing this time with Dolphin, and running with the optimized settings down in the description, we see a curious change from prior games in the series. This one runs at 30 frames per second. This is the first chance I've had to test a 30 FPS game for the series, and yeah, Dolphin doesn't do too well here either. Despite the lower performance target, the same issues that have permeated all other Dolphin games are still here, namely bad frame pacing and consistent frame rate drops akin to double buffered VSync kicking in. Outside of that, On Tour actually looks, sounds and controls quite well on Dolphin. The lower target frame rate of this version means I likely won't be recommending that you play it over the other ports, but compatibility is okay outside of those performance gripes. SSX On Tour on deck gets a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10. I would love to tell you that the Xbox version of SSX On Tour runs flawlessly on the deck at a full 60 FPS, but well, I can't, as it doesn't even boot. This could very well be down to the specific rip of the game that I'm playing, but I've seen others online report the same issue with On Tour's Xbox version within XEMU. The game boots, displays the EA splash screen, plays the intro cinematic, and then you get a black screen. You're in the abyss. You can still hear the game running in the background, and it does respond to button presses. Sadly, it just won't display anything. This sad chain of events lands the Xbox port of SSX On Tour with a 1 out of 10 compatibility rating on Steam Deck. When I first booted up SSX On Tour within PPSSPP, I thought to myself, everything is right with the world. SSX is back at 60 frames per second. Despite the speed you move at in the game, however, it all felt oddly sluggish. It wasn't until I loaded up PPSSPP's internal OSD that I realised it's actually running at 30 frames per second, just like the GameCube version in Dolphin. Oh well. Thankfully, it is a superior experience over Dolphin. Frame pacing is smooth enough, however I did spot some issues when I was boosting. which compromised my control over the game at some pretty crucial moments. Audio in this instance was good, but not great, with sound quality dipping severely whenever the performance failed to hold up. The PlayStation 2 version of the game is lacking the hard frame drops and overall constant stutter of the GameCube port. However, its own issues mean it scores an 8 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Okay, this is a very strange game. It's also the first appearance that the PSP has had on this show, so hello PSP, please don't let us down. You're currently looking at the PSP version of On Tour running via PPSSPP, which is the only version of the game to run at 60 FPS. However, it's also essentially a completely different game to the home console versions. Now, look, I don't want to detract from the game. This isn't like the GBA versions of SSX Tricky and SSX3, but this is not at all at the same level of quality as the other versions of the game, despite the smoothly paced 60 frames per second output. As you can likely tell, the track designs, the goals, collectibles, and even the overall aesthetic are all very different to the home console version. I'd almost go as far as to say that this looks a lot like SSX3. Could it be the case that EA were working on a port of SSX3 for the PSP before they retooled it at the 11th hour to line up with On Tour's launch? Despite the game's weird aesthetic and unhelpful camera, if you switch on VSync within PPSSPP and off within the deck's menu, you get a crisp and smooth rendition of the game. It's in keeping with the cursed nature of this series so far that the absolute worst versions of these games get the best compatibility scores, but here we are. SSX On Tour on PPSSPP gets a compatibility score of 10 out of 10 on deck. Shocking. With SSX On Tour wrapped up, we're now into the home stretch. Here are the scores for each version of the game. The PlayStation 2 version takes the award, and the PSP version is a fever dream anomaly. Neither console could be here to claim this award today, but the PSP has asked us to thank both Ridge Racer and proprietary memory formats on their behalf. Following the somewhat tepid reaction to SSX On Tour, EA decided to pivot away from the hardcore roots that the series had sown and into the direction of a less critical and perhaps more welcoming audience with SSX Blur. Launching for the Wii in early 2007, there was only one version of the game, and this one used motion controls. It's easy to roll our eyes in disgust as we look back on this decision, but you have to remember that the industry was still very much in its honeymoon phase with motion controls at this stage, a stint that would last right up past the launch of the PS Move and the Kinect sensor years later. As for Blur itself, well, it's exactly what you would expect out of a Wii exclusive SSX game. Any of the sass and edginess that was present in the series up to that point was beaten out of it, and we were left with perhaps the most saccharine iteration of the franchise that will ever exist. The motion controls are complicated and tiring, however they do work. It's just that whilst you're playing the game, you're constantly thinking to yourself, I'd much rather play this with buttons. I'm sure you can imagine the problems this presents for playing the game on the deck then. To emudeck's credit, there's an emulated Wii Remote and Nunchuck control scheme set by default when you boot up a Wii game within Dolphin. However, it looks like it would be more suited to a first-person shooter instead of an extreme sports game. I mean, look, if you really wanted to, I'm sure that you could spend the time to create a custom mapping that allows you to do most of what you'd want to do in this game, but I don't think it's really worth it. By default, and even with reasonable tweaks, the game is essentially unplayable on the deck, and for that reason, it receives a 3 out of 10 for compatibility. In what could perhaps be considered a course correction of a course correction, EA decided that the best route forward for SSX was for it to receive an ultra gritty reboot in 2012 for the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Given the lineage of SSX as a series, the launch of this entry was weirdly muted. I remember it happening, I just remember it not really mattering all that much. It's a shame too, because the mechanics at the centre of this reboot are strong. The game takes place against this weird backdrop of a rift developing between the characters, and they have a big fight and form separate teams, and it's all very gritty and they're wearing armour and all that stuff. It's the control scheme that's the main draw here though. The classic controls are back, but you can also use a right stick control scheme in a similar fashion to EA's other extreme sports series. This feels shockingly intuitive, and if a snowboarding game were to come along today with this control scheme in tow, I can't help but feel it would be a huge success. You know what isn't a huge success? Trying to emulate the 360 version of this game on the Steam Deck. Whilst there isn't a working Linux version of the Xenia emulator or its Canary fork, which improves performance drastically, there is a roundabout way to get it installed on your deck with some manual tweaking. I did this, got the game over to my deck, started the game, saw the EA splash screen, and nothing. I was treated to a black screen with audio. In light of that poor showing, SSX on Xenia gets a compatibility rating of 1 out of 10. Switching over to the PlayStation 3 version of the game running through RPCS3, and we managed to get to the home screen of the game, and into its opening tutorial. The frame rate is wildly inconsistent here though, and on each occasion that I tried to test the game, RPCS3 ended up crashing before the tutorial was complete. Even if we had managed to get past the tutorial in this instance, I can't imagine we would have been in for a very good time. RPCS3 doesn't run all that well on account of the fact that the Steam Deck uses a 4-core 8-thread CPU. This emulator is heavily dependent on threads and throughput that the Steam Deck just can't provide. The PS3 version of SSX gets a compatibility rating of 2 out of 10 on deck. Ooh, what a round! Nail-biting stuff there for sure. The PlayStation 3 takes the W, along with the honorary Shittest Victory Award. And that is all she wrote, every single testable SSX game running on deck, or not running, as the case may be. Thanks very much for joining me on this long, arduous and painful Game Boy Advance tainted journey. It's been a long one, but we made it in the end. Be sure to join me for the next episode, where I'll be testing out a series that rhymes with turnspout.